Well, let's shift our attention out here at Husker Harvest Days now over to the markets. Joining us this week is Dr. Matt Roberts. He's the senior grain analyst with Terrain. We've got a report to talk about. That was the talk of Husker Harvest Days, and what do you know? A lot of the producers I visited weren't particularly happy with USDA. What numbers did you take away from the WASDE that you want to make sure we walk away with on this conversation?
So I think there's two really important takeaways from the WASDE that came out this week. The first is demand, both corn and soybeans, is tepid at best. There's not really much to be excited. We did see some good sales finally last week for new crops, some good weekly export. Those weren't in the WASDE. But overall, the big picture is really weak international demand. And we're not lining up to see that really strengthen with the low levels of the Mississippi River, where it's going to be harder and harder to ship out the Gulf. Strong dollar, higher interest rates, all the things are kind of against us. And we see that there. The other thing that I think is really important to see, and I know a lot of producers, when we're out here at Husker Harvest Days, they have a hard time believing that we are going to see a 170, 173.8 is USDA's forecast there. They have a hard time believing that there's any way that's the case. And the reality is, as hard as it may be for some farmers to believe, and I was on the phone earlier today with a farmer, he's convinced it's going to do 160 this year. And honest to goodness, as hard as it is to believe that, the reality is this was the USDA's objective yield. They're going out, they're sampling hundreds of farms around the country, and probably the best designed objective survey, and this is what they find. Now, as I like to say, do I think the USDA is always right? No. But honestly, they're wrong less than anybody else. They're consistently wrong less than anybody else. So the things that I really want growers to take away: demand is weak. Yields are, we're not going to 160. There's a lot of corn out here. Not everybody, there's a lot of corn out here. There's a lot of beans out here. And if you're banking on going to $7 next year, which I've certainly heard people, or even $6, you need something that is not on the horizon right now.
It's a good point. Sometimes we struggle with backyarditis, I think is what you call that symptom of what's happening here. That's what we want to focus on. But I want to kind of pivot this conversation to outside the U.S. borders and talk about South America. A lot of attention has to be paid down there, and for good reason. And one of the things that you can speak to, and I'd like you to, is their expansion. We continue to see rapid expansion of acreage down there, but we might, I guess the emphasis on the might, see a slowdown of that. Why might that be?
Well, there's a lot of factors that go into particularly in Brazil, that rapid expansion in Mato Grosso that we've seen over the past 15 to 20 years. And most of that ground is what they call the Cerrados. Think of it as like savanna land. It's that stuff we saw in Mutual of Omaha growing up, though that was in Africa, this is in Brazil, converting that into row crops. The big issues to understand in Mato Grosso: very high rainfall, 70, 80 inches, very, very sandy soil, okay? So huge rain, very sandy soil. So it's really almost like the world's largest hydroponic farm. Any nutrients that you want your crop to have, you've got to supply there. So intense logistical demands, both going in and out of that region in a country that really has third world infrastructure. So as we look at this expansion we've had in Brazil, yes, the last couple of years we've seen acres expand. But think about the prices we've had in the United States. We've had $6 corn, we've had $15 beans, and that justifies a lot more investments in converting acres, in building roads, in paving roads, all of these improving ports. Now as we back off, okay, as prices back off, it's much, much harder in Brazil to keep those levels of expansion going. And what we're seeing is a lot more tightness, particularly on the corn side, with those inputs they've got to bring in, not just carry out. So I think there is, at these kinds of price levels we're seeing, yes, we know right now we're getting export competition, but as we start to look to next year, I think there is some hope that this will slow down. This acreage expansion is going to pause a little bit and allow global markets to catch its breath.
We'll keep an eye on that for sure.
Yeah.
Back here in the U.S., last time you and I visited was down in Kansas City. I think that was last November. And we were talking about this push to electric cars and how that might influence ethanol. You said it's obviously something to pay close attention to, but it's not something that is going to shut down ethanol plants tomorrow. Has your outlook on that changed at all in the months as we continue to see this push toward electric?
It really hasn't. I think that it's a great story that electrification is gonna run gasoline out. It's gonna run everything else out. But the reality is, as all of your viewers know, first of all, cars are incredibly more expensive now. Average new car in America is $47,000, and so as a result, we're keeping older cars longer. We're holding on to them. They're less electrified. There's certainly indication that it is harder to keep electric cars on the road for 10 years, 15 years, 20. I have a 30-year-old car sitting in my driveway right now that I love. That's not going to be a thing with electric vehicles. But even in these mandates, California and the states that align with it, those aren't really going to have an impact on ethanol, and for another 10 years. We'll start to maybe feel it in 5 to 7. 10 years, we will start to measure it. 20 years before it really matters. Why? For a lot of pieces of the country, electrification still doesn't work. We see a lot of these discussions about, first of all, electric infrastructure. When we talk about rural areas, it's that much more stress, but even suburban areas. We talk about building enough chargers and maintaining them. At any given time, it's a really significant 20-25% of chargers don't work.
Wow.
It's very common to pull up, now not the Teslas, but all these others, to pull up and not be able to find a working charger. When I travel, I rent electric cars pretty often because I think it's fascinating. And it's a common occurrence. So there's a lot of issues here that it's a really good story. I think this is not ethanol's or the corn market's biggest threat. And then when we talk about sustainable aviation fuel and the possibilities there, that's another pathway for ethanol really to use to get more demand. And so I'm not really bearish on the outlook for ethanol over the next 5, 10, 20 years. And honestly, 20 years out, the world's going to change so much. I'm not sure it's worth talking about.
Who knows what it's going to look like at that point.
Exactly.
Matt, we really appreciate the update. It's good to catch up with you again.
Thank you so much, Bryce. It's nice to see you.